Marcus Chen had once stood on the highest floors of Manhattan's most exclusive buildings, but today he sat on a cardboard box in apartment 4B, eating cold beans from a can. The irony wasn't lost on him. He owned this entire block, yet he lived like he had nothing. 3 months ago, his world had collapsed in the most devastating way possible. His younger brother David, the only family he had left, had died in a car accident while rushing to meet Marcus for their weekly dinner. The guilt ate at him like acid. David had been speeding because Marcus, consumed with closing another billion-dollar deal, had moved their dinner reservation to an impossible time. "Just this once," Marcus had said. Those 3 words haunted every breath he took. The funeral had been a blur of fake sympathy from business associates who saw opportunity in his grief. That night, Marcus made a decision that shocked everyone. He would disappear from his old life entirely. He needed to understand what really mattered, to feel what ordinary people felt, to strip away the layers of wealth that had blinded him to humanity. So he chose to live among them, in the very buildings he owned but had never truly seen. The property manager with an iron fist. Victoria Rodriguez had clawed her way up from nothing, and she wasn't about to let anyone take advantage of her position as property manager of the Riverside complex. Growing up in the same neighborhood, she'd watched her mother scrub floors for pennies while deadbeat tenants lived rent-free above them. Never again. She ran her buildings like a fortress, and her reputation was her greatest weapon. Pay or leave was her motto, and she'd earned her nickname, the Iron Lady, by never backing down from a fight. When she first laid eyes on Marcus Chen, she saw everything she despised. Another man who thought the world owed him something. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt, and worst of all, he had that defeated look in his eyes that she associated with people who'd given up. "Listen, Mr. Chen," she'd said during their first encounter, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "I don't care what sob story you have. Rent is due on the 1st, no exceptions." What she didn't know was that Marcus Chen wasn't just any tenant. He was her boss's boss's boss. But Marcus had given strict instructions to his legal team. No one was to know his true identity. He wanted to experience life as everyone else did, to feel the weight of bills and the fear of eviction. He thought it would help him heal, help him understand the brother he'd lost while chasing money. 3 weeks into his new life, Marcus received his first warning notice. Victoria had slipped it under his door with the kind of aggressive precision that spoke of years of practice. "Final notice," it read in bold red letters, even though it was only his first late payment. Marcus couldn't help but smile. If only she knew that her salary was paid from the same account that could buy this entire city block. He'd been deliberately living off the small amount of cash he'd withdrawn, wanting to experience genuine financial stress. The irony was beautiful and terrible. He was learning what his tenants had always known, that Victoria Rodriguez was ruthless. Through his thin walls, he could hear her berating Mrs. Patterson from apartment 3A for being 2 days late with her rent. The elderly woman was crying, explaining that her medication costs had gone up, but Victoria's response was ice cold. "That's not my problem. Figure it out or get out." Marcus felt something stir in his chest, an anger he hadn't felt in years. This woman worked for him, was paid by his company, yet she treated his tenants like garbage. But he couldn't reveal himself, not yet. He needed to see how deep this went, needed to understand the system he'd unknowingly created. That night, he called his assistant from a payphone. "I want a full report on every property manager in our portfolio," he said quietly. "I'm every complaint, every eviction, every interaction with tenants, and Sarah. Make it thorough." The morning Victoria Rodriguez decided to evict Marcus Chen, She wore her best power suit, the navy blue one that made her feel invincible. She dealt with hundreds of deadbeat tenants, and this one wouldn't be any different. She found him sitting by his window, reading an old paperback book that looked like it had been rescued from a dumpster. "Mr. Chen," she announced, her heels clicking against the worn linoleum floor. "You have exactly 30 minutes to pack your belongings and vacate the premises." Marcus looked up slowly, his eyes taking in her aggressive posture, her satisfied smirk. For a moment, she saw something flicker in his gaze. Not fear, but something else. Disappointment, maybe. "I understand you're just doing your job," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying an odd formality that seemed out of place in the shabby apartment. "But may I ask, do you enjoy this part of your work?" The question caught Victoria off guard. Most tenants begged, cried, or got angry. This man seemed genuinely curious about her feelings. "What I enjoy," she snapped, regaining her composure, "is maintaining order. This building has standards and you don't meet them." Marcus nodded slowly, closing his book and setting it aside. He'd learned everything he needed to know about Victoria Rodriguez. She wasn't just following company policy. She was enjoying the power, feeding off the fear and desperation of people who had nowhere else to go. What happened next would haunt Victoria Rodriguez for the rest of her career, though she didn't know it yet. Marcus began gathering his few possessions, a single suitcase, some books, a photograph of his brother that he kept face down on the nightstand. Victoria watched, arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. "Move faster," she commanded. "I have real tenants to attend to." That word, real, cut deeper than Marcus had expected. Here he was, the man who'd built an empire from nothing, being dismissed as less than human by someone who worked for him. But what truly angered him was thinking about all the other tenants she'd treated this way. How many families had she destroyed with her callousness? How many people had suffered because of his negligence as an owner? "You know what I think?" Victoria continued, warming up to her favorite sport, crushing the spirits of people she saw as beneath her. "I think you're one of those entitled losers who thinks the world owes you something. Well, newsflash, it doesn't. Maybe getting kicked out will teach you some responsibility." Marcus paused in his packing, his hand resting on the photograph of David. His brother had always been the kind one, the one who remembered their struggles growing up poor. David would have been disgusted by what this company had become under Marcus's absent leadership. "You're absolutely right," Marcus said quietly, surprising Victoria. "I have been entitled. I've been blind to how my choices affect others. Thank you for opening my eyes." Victoria Rodriguez had expected begging, tears, or at least some pushback, but this calm acceptance threw her completely off balance. And she didn't like feeling off balance. In her world, power meant making others feel small, and this strange man wasn't playing by the rules, so she decided to escalate. "Look at you," she snarled, following Marcus as he carried his suitcase toward the door. "Pathetic. 40-something years old and getting evicted like a college dropout. What would your family think if they could see you now?" The mention of family hit Marcus like a physical blow. The photograph of David seemed to burn in his pocket, and for the first time in months, he felt the familiar rage that had once driven him to build an empire. But he swallowed it, channeled it, transformed it into something else, a cold determination for justice. "I imagine," Marcus said slowly, not turning around, "they would want me to do better, to be better, to make sure that people in positions of power don't abuse those who can't fight back." Victoria laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the narrow hallway. "Positions of power? Look around, Mr. Chen. I'm the one with power here. You're nothing. Nobody. A ghost who won't even be remembered once that door closes behind you." Other tenants had gathered in their doorways, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Patterson from 3A watched with tears in her eyes, recognizing her own humiliation in the scene. Young Miguel from 2B clenched his fists, remembering his own encounters with Victoria's cruelty. They all felt helpless, trapped in a system that seemed designed to crush them. As Marcus reached the building's exit, Victoria delivered what she thought would be her killing blow. "And don't even think about coming back!" she shouted from the top of the stairwell, her voice echoing through the building like a war cry. "I've got your picture, your information, everything. You're blacklisted from every decent building in this city. You'll be lucky to find a cardboard box under a bridge." The words hung in the air like poison, and Marcus could feel the eyes of every tenant burning into his back. These were good people, hard-working people who deserved dignity and respect, not the systematic cruelty he'd unknowingly enabled. He turned around one last time, looking up at Victoria's triumphant face, memorizing every detail of this moment. "Miss Rodriguez," he called out, his voice carrying a strange new authority that made several tenants straighten up. "I want you to remember this day. Remember how you treated someone you thought was powerless. Remember the joy you took in their suffering. Because sometimes the universe has a way of teaching us who we really are." Victoria's laughter followed him out into the street, but there was something in his tone that made her feel momentarily uneasy. She shook it off quickly. She'd heard empty threats from desperate tenants before. This was no different, or so she thought. As Marcus walked away, pulling his single suitcase behind him, he made a mental note of every detail. Every cracked window, every broken step, every violation he could see from the street. His other properties probably had the same problems, managed by people just like Victoria, who'd forgotten that their power came with responsibility. That evening, Marcus sat in a small diner 3 blocks away, using their Wi-Fi to access his company's internal systems from a laptop he'd bought with cash. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Victoria Rodriguez wasn't an anomaly. She was the standard. Complaint after complaint filled the digital files, painting a picture of systematic abuse across his entire property portfolio. Families evicted for being days late on rent during medical emergencies. Elderly tenants harassed until they moved out so apartments could be renovated and rented at higher prices. Children forced to change schools because their parents couldn't keep up with sudden rent increases. Marcus had built his empire by acquiring struggling buildings and maximizing their potential, but he had never looked closely at what that meant for the people living there. He'd hired property managers like Victoria because they got results: higher profits, fewer problem tenants, efficient turnover. He'd never asked about their methods. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant, Sarah. "Sir, you asked for reports on property managers. The data is disturbing. Victoria Rodriguez has the highest eviction rate in our portfolio, but also the highest profit margins. Should I prepare a summary?" Marcus stared at the message, remembering David's voice from their last conversation. "Sometimes I wonder if we've lost sight of why we started this company, Marcus. Dad always said business should lift people up, not tear them down." His brother had been trying to tell him something, and Marcus had been too busy to listen. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus conducted his own investigation, visiting his properties disguised as a potential tenant, a maintenance worker, a social worker. What he found shattered every assumption he'd held about his business success. The Chen property group wasn't just profitable, it was built on human misery. He watched Victoria Rodriguez's counterparts across the city, all following the same playbook: maximize rent, minimize maintenance, remove anyone who couldn't keep up with increasingly impossible demands. In Newark, he met Maria Santos, a single mother who'd been evicted by one of his managers for being 3 days late with rent, while her daughter was in the hospital. In Queens, he sat with elderly Mr. Kim, who'd been forced to choose between his heart medication and his rent payment. In Brooklyn, he witnessed a family of 5, getting their belongings thrown into the street because their teenage son's part-time job wasn't enough to cover a sudden rent increase. Each story was a dagger to his conscience, but they were also fuel for what was coming next. Marcus began documenting everything, taking photographs, recording conversations, gathering evidence of practices that were legal but morally bankrupt. His lawyers would have advised against it, but Marcus was beyond caring about legal exposure. He was preparing for war, and the battlefield would be his own empire. That night, he called an emergency board meeting for the following week, claiming urgent business matters that required immediate attention. His board members, accustomed to his decisive leadership, quickly agreed. They had no idea that their CEO had just declared war on everything they'd built together. The morning of the board meeting, Marcus Chen walked into the gleaming conference room of Chen Property Group, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His board members barely looked up from their tablets and coffee cups. Just another quarterly review, or so they thought. "Gentlemen, ladies," Marcus began, his voice carrying an edge that made his CFO glance up sharply. "We need to discuss the true cost of our success." For the next hour, Marcus presented his findings with the precision of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. Photographs of overcrowded apartments with broken heating systems, audio recordings of property managers threatening tenants, financial records showing how they'd systematically priced out working families to make room for higher-paying residents. His head of operations, James Wright, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Marcus, this is unfortunate, but it's not illegal. We're running a business, not a charity." "You're absolutely right, James," Marcus replied, his smile cold as winter steel. "It's not illegal. It's just immoral, predatory, and everything my father taught me never to become." The room fell silent. Marcus's father had died when the company was still small, but his principles had supposedly guided every major decision. Now those principles lay in ruins, sacrificed on the altar of quarterly profits. "I'm implementing immediate changes across all properties," Marcus continued. "Rent freezes, mandatory maintenance upgrades, and most importantly, a complete restructuring of our management philosophy. We're going to remember that we're in the business of providing homes, not extracting maximum profit from human desperation." That same morning, Victoria Rodriguez strutted into the Riverside complex, feeling particularly pleased with herself. The eviction of Marcus Chen had sent a clear message to the other tenants. She was in charge, and she wouldn't tolerate any nonsense. She'd even gotten a commendation from her district supervisor for maintaining such high occupancy rates and profit margins. What she didn't know was that Marcus had spent the previous evening reviewing her employee file in detail. Every complaint, every violation, every cruel decision was documented in stark corporate language that somehow made her actions seem even more callous. Her salary, her benefits, even her annual bonus, all paid for by the same man she'd humiliated just 2 weeks earlier. Victoria was reorganizing her office when her assistant knocked tentatively on the door. "Ms. Rodriguez, there's been an announcement from corporate, some kind of company-wide policy change." Victoria barely looked up from her paperwork. Corporate announcements were usually just bureaucratic nonsense about sensitivity training or safety protocols. "Just email me the highlights, Janet," she said dismissively. But Janet remained in the doorway, her face pale. "Ma'am, I think you should read this yourself. It's about tenant relations policies. And there's going to be a surprise inspection of all properties by the CEO himself." For the first time all morning, Victoria felt a flutter of concern. CEO inspections were rare, usually reserved for properties with serious problems. But her building was profitable, her methods effective. What could they possibly find wrong? 3 days later, Victoria Rodriguez stood in her best power suit, flanked by a team of corporate executives she'd never seen before, waiting for the legendary CEO of Chen Property Group to arrive. She'd spent 72 hours turning the Riverside complex into a showpiece. Fresh paint in the lobby, maintenance issues suddenly fixed, even flowers in the entrance. Local news crews waited outside, apparently tipped off about some major corporate announcement. Victoria preened for the cameras, imagining her promotion to regional manager after this successful inspection. When the black sedan pulled up, Victoria smoothed her jacket and prepared her most professional smile. She'd practiced her presentation dozens of times, emphasizing her efficiency, her profit margins, her no-nonsense approach to tenant management. The car door opened, and Victoria stepped forward to greet the CEO of one of the city's most powerful property companies. Her smile froze on her face as Marcus Chen stepped onto the sidewalk. But this time he wasn't wearing second-hand clothes and carrying a battered suitcase. This Marcus Chen commanded attention without effort, his presence filling the space around him like gravity. His suit was impeccable, his bearing confident, his eyes sharp, with an intelligence that Victoria was only now beginning to recognize. "Ms. Rodriguez," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying easily to the gathered crowd of tenants, reporters, and corporate executives. "I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss." Victoria Rodriguez felt the earth shift beneath her feet as the impossible became reality. The homeless-looking man she'd evicted, the deadbeat she'd humiliated in front of the entire building, was Marcus Chen, the billionaire CEO who literally owned everything she'd built her career upon. Her mind raced, trying to process the implications, trying to find some way to salvage the situation. But the math was simple and devastating. She had just destroyed her own life with her own cruelty. "I believe you told me I would never find decent housing in this city," Marcus continued, his voice carrying to the crowd of tenants who had gathered on the building's steps. Mrs. Patterson was there, her eyes wide with recognition and growing delight. Miguel stood beside her, his mouth agape as he connected the dots. "You also said I was pathetic, entitled, and that my family would be ashamed of me." Victoria's throat felt like sandpaper. The news cameras were rolling, capturing every moment of what was clearly going to be her complete professional destruction. Her district supervisor stood frozen beside her, his face growing paler by the second as he calculated his own career damage. "Mr. Chen," Victoria stammered, her voice barely above a whisper, I was just doing my job. I didn't know. How could I have known?" "Exactly," Marcus replied, and there was something almost sad in his voice. "You didn't know. You treated someone terribly because you thought they couldn't fight back. You took joy in their suffering because you believed they were powerless. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Marcus Chen looked out at the crowd that had gathered, his tenants, the people Victoria Rodriguez had systematized, abused for years, all waiting to see what justice looked like when it finally arrived. "Ms. Rodriguez," he continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had just remembered his own power, "effective immediately, you are terminated from Chen Property Group. Your actions over the past years have violated every principle this company was founded upon." The crowd erupted in a mixture of gasps and cheers, but Marcus raised his hand for silence. This wasn't about revenge. It was about something much more important. "But more than that," he continued, turning to address the tenants directly, "I owe all of you an apology. I've been absent from the day-to-day operations of this company, and that absence allowed people like Ms. Rodriguez to treat you as less than human. That ends today." Victoria made one last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of her career. "Sir, please, my methods were effective. I increased profits, maintained order, followed all company policies." "You followed the letter of policies while destroying their spirit," Marcus replied. You forgot that behind every apartment number is a human being with dignity, struggles, and dreams. You turned housing into a weapon instead of a foundation for people to build their lives upon. The news cameras captured every word as Marcus outlined the immediate changes: rent controls, improved maintenance, tenant advocacy programs, and most importantly, a complete cultural transformation in how the company viewed its relationship with the people it served. As Victoria Rodriguez cleaned out her office under the watchful eyes of security guards, Marcus Chen stood in the apartment that had been his home for 3 months. 4B, the place where he'd learned to see his empire through the eyes of the people it was supposed to serve. The irony was complete. He'd gone looking for a way to honor his brother's memory and had instead discovered that he'd betrayed everything David had believed in. His phone buzzed with messages from board members, investors, and competitors, all trying to understand why one of the city's most successful property moguls had just declared war on his own business model. The answer was simple, even if the execution would be complex. He'd remembered what it felt like to be human. Over the following months, the changes Marcus implemented would cost Chen Property Group millions in short-term profits, but they would save something more valuable: the soul of a company that had forgotten its purpose. Victoria Rodriguez would eventually find another job, but never again in property management, and never without the shadow of her viral humiliation following her. But that was tomorrow's story. Today, Marcus Chen sat in his humble apartment, looking at the photograph of his brother, finally understanding what David had been trying to tell him during their last conversation. Success without compassion was just expensive failure, and power without responsibility was just cruelty with a better address. The billionaire who had owned everything had needed to lose it all to remember what really mattered: that behind every door, every lease, every rent payment was a human story deserving of dignity and respect. What did you think of Marcus's incredible transformation? Have you ever encountered someone who abused their power like Victoria Rodriguez? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story inspired you, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible billionaire stories that will blow your mind. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads, and check out the playlist in the description for more shocking tales of wealth, power, and justice. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next.